We were saddened to hear the news that our beloved April M. Branch, executive assistant to Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. and faithful servant, made her transition suddenly. April meant so much to so many. She was a fearless freedom fighter, a devout fashionista, a staunch community, education, and women's rights advocate, an odds defier, a devoted mentor to many, refined perfume purveyor, a consummate fundraiser, supreme nurturer, an avid book reader, a historian, a sought-after chef, a relentless push alumni archivist, a green-thumbed plant whisperer, an avid art collector, a restaurant connoisseur, a bangle music maker, a lover of video games, a Julian Jaguar's mantle bearer, a fireball of energy, and a blessed gatherer of family and friends. April had a tough mind, but a tender heart. If April Branch hugged you, all of your fears and tears were wiped away. We will miss you, April, until the end of time. What a woman. April Branch, your life mattered. May she rest in heavenly peace and power. A job well done. April M. Branch.
Greetings to our Rainbow Push family. When we think of women globally, one thing that is true, whether you're in Nairobi, Kinshasa, Chicago, Stockholm, or Geneva, women wear many hats. We wear many hats. That's just the reality. Whether you're a mother, whether you're a caregiver, whether you're a businesswoman, whether you're just someone who is fighting a good fight each and every day. One thing that's undeniable is just that as women, we are called upon to do so much and to juggle and to wear many hats day in and day out. Indeed, we've heard from extraordinary women from the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, from the National Council of Negro Women, the National Council of Jewish Women, the League of Women Voters, and the incomparable Stacey Abrams. And from all of those women, especially from Dr. Jacqueline Jackson, who truly is, I believe, one of the most enduring and brilliant mothers of the civil and human rights movements. We know that wearing so many hats has become commonplace to her as she successfully navigated throughout history over the past 6 decades in the civil and human rights movements. And so it gives me a great deal of honor to welcome you to our Rainbow Push Convention, our annual convention, in recognition of the International Women's Roundtable Luncheon, and in recognition of those women who preceded us and those who will be in front of us, who will continue to wear many hats and succeed despite the odds.
I'm Rabbi Rachel Weiss of the Jewish Reconstructionist Congregation in Evanston, Illinois. May the one who blessed our ancestors, the sources from which we come, who stood by them in wilderness and wandering, who accompanied their cries and their triumphs, bring blessings on us all on this day. May our words, our bodies, our struggles, and our songs be the prayer that reaches depths and heights. Bless our hands, that they may create and shape loving and welcoming communities. Celebrate our work. May our labors always be met with a living wage and equal treatment, gratitude and time for rest. May our hands be vessels of healing and discovery, equitable distributors of treatment and care and resources. May we always reach out to one another. Bless our eyes, that we may take the risk to vision a world that is as it could be. We pray to see the potential for change and growth beneath the outer shells of judgment and bias, so deeply ingrained behind the walls of systemic racism and hatred, xenophobia, transphobia, and homophobia, that we may vision an equitable world and a just humanity. Bless the paths of our feet, that they may take active steps toward justice and righteousness and safety for all. May we march together, show up together, sit down and stand up together. Bless our mouths, that we may bring our empowered voices to shine light on the places we disregard. Bless the power of speech to let our stories expose the violence and shame too long hidden. Bless the vote and the voice to choose and determine. Bless our ears, that we may hear uncomfortable truths. Let the sounds of oppression, disenfranchisement, brutality, and violation of humanity linger until we are willing to hear beyond our own privilege and allow ourselves to listen. May this listening be transformative. Bless our hearts, that they beat on and on and on as long as they can, as long as we can. May the source of compassion awaken in us all and in the hearts of our political and civic leaders to act, legislate, and lead us to righteousness. May we be strong and resolute. Let us feel the brokenness, and let us swell with celebration, for joy is also an act of spiritual resistance, and it is with song that we will lead the way to transformation. Source of all, seeds and fruit, roots and branches, of one planet that is ours to protect, may we be intertwined and interdependent. Source of science and healing and discovery, push our boundaries beyond what has been, until through our stretching, we encompass all as one. Soon, in our days, in this moment, right now. Awaken our hands, our eyes, our feet, our mouths, our ears, our hearts in the great body of all humanity. Source of all, so may it be. Amen.
Greetings. My name is attorney NATASHA Sarah Lorraine Banks. And on behalf of Rainbow Push Coalition and all of our event affiliates, we are so excited to introduce our next speaker. A New York Times best-selling author, powerhouse political leader, and voting rights maven. She served in the Georgia House of Representatives for 11 years, 7 of which she served as the Democratic leader. In 2018, she became the first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee as the Democratic nominee for the governor of Georgia, winning at the time the most votes that any Democrat has won in that state's history. Over the course of her career, she has founded multiple organizations devoted to voting rights and tackling social justice issues on both the state and national level. After witnessing the gross mismanagement and the voter suppression in the 2018 gubernatorial election in Georgia, she propelled the movement to increase voter accessibility and turnout by launching Fair Fight Action, an initiative to fund and train voter protection teams in 20 battleground states. In 2019, she also founded Fair Count to ensure accuracy in the 2020 census and greater participation in civic engagement. She also founded the Southern Economic Advancement Project, a public policy initiative to broaden economic power and equity in the South. Her voting advocacy work has started and inspired so many organizations that work to register and turn out voters, particularly young voters and voters of color. She is credited with being, if not the, but one of the major forces behind the Democrats' win in Georgia in the 2020 presidential and Senate races. For her work, she has received numerous awards, most recently being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in February 2001. Without further delay, Rainbow Push Coalition is so excited to introduce to you one of the most prominent politicians and activist of all time, STACEY Abrams.
Thank you all so much for having me here today as we have this incredibly important conversation about our communities, both local and international. We know that in 2020 and 2021, COVID-19 has consumed the bulk of our conversations. Whether we're talking about what we do with our children when they get ready to go back to school, how we take care of our elders as they have to protect themselves from COVID, how we plan for tomorrow. And for communities of color, for women of color, for Black women in particular, the conversation of who we are and what we become in this age of COVID has never been more important. What I want to do today is set the conversation in order, because I know there will be an important panel discussion that follows. But what we need to understand, what we have to hold on to, are three things. That COVID in this moment reveals who we are. Our response shows who we want to be, and that we have an obligation to do more. Who we are is not something that's a secret to most of us. We have lived with the challenges that COVID has revealed. For some, this was news, but for so many, for too many, for the marginalized and the disadvantaged, it was simply the same old headline. You see, we live in a nation that has a broken healthcare system, in a world that doesn't believe that everyone has the right to access to healthcare. We live in a space that has a broken infrastructure system, so that when the deployment of a vaccine became possible, it was still far-fetched for too many. These opportunities to protect ourselves against what we know is a deadly disease were stymied by distance and infrastructure and lack of information. And worse, misinformation has proliferated to make it almost impossible for us to believe that this salvation belongs to us. And connecting these two pieces, connecting the broken healthcare infrastructure and the broken public infrastructure, is an international link. Because even today, 10 billion doses of this vaccine are necessary to protect the world, and yet we are far, far, far from that number. And we know that when pieces of our nation are broken, when parts of our world are broken, those who suffer the consequences are not the ones who did the breaking. It's those who need the mending to be done, those who are so often called upon to take care of and tend to, but are left out of the opportunities. COVID has revealed who we are, but our responsibility is to understand what that means. And what I see, what I hear, what I know is that it is an opportunity for us to show who we are. You see, I live in the state of Georgia, and my parents are 72, raising my 15-year-old niece. And when I would go and visit them, I used to think of myself as going to visit Armageddon. You had two generations standing on opposite sides of this conversation, baby boomers and Generation Zoomers, trying to figure out how to work together. And what linked them together beyond blood and love and faith was the reality that COVID had leveled the playing field. You see, both my parents and my niece have health issues that made it important that they be protected from COVID. They had to work around the fact that Faith was now going to school online, and my parents are not the most technically savvy. They had to navigate the start of high school, trying to figure out what to do in the midst of a pandemic. And what they learned, what I learned, what I see every day when I talk to people, not only in Georgia, but around the country, is that one thing COVID has revealed is that we are resilient. We are people who understand that the worst will be visited upon us, but our opportunity is to turn that bad into better. That we can not only survive what has happened, we can find ways to communicate, connect, and to create change that sometimes belies where we are. And if there was ever a moment of conversation about our resilience, it was what happened to George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. It was the racial reckoning that swept through this moment of global pandemic that still required us to be resilient and to hold fast to our beliefs that we deserve better from our communities. And for women in particular, women who had to tend to those families that were broken, women who had to lift up those communities that were being decimated, women who had to comfort those who were in crisis, we understand that resilience is a part of our DNA. COVID has revealed who we are by revealing what we're capable of. And number one, we're capable of resilience. But it also reminded us that we are also always the marginalized. You see, in a broken healthcare system, it's not simply whether you can get access to a ventilator or access to a vaccine. We still have Black mothers and brown mothers trying to give birth in an era of maternal mortality that belies the technological advances in our communities, where we still face racial discrimination in trying to give life, and we have to fight to be treated fairly when we are facing death. We know that in this economy where children being taken care of is often the work of women, that the breakdown and the destruction and the collapse of our childcare system hurt women hardest, and that it has got to be front and center in any conversation of recovery. We know that our economic future depends on the future of our women, especially women of color, and therefore we prove who we are when we respond to this pandemic by lifting up those women who've been pushed to the outer edges of our economy but deserve to be in its center. But most of all, what we learned about ourselves in this moment is that we are determined. Because you see, in 2020, and if you lived in Georgia in 2021, we had some elections. And in those elections, we decided to speak up and say that we deserve better than leadership that told us we were on our own. That if you live in a society, we are obliged to serve and act as a society, that we are yoked together by our common destiny, our common demise. And we decided to vote for leaders who believed that we deserved better. And by voting into office those who will see us and hear us, we received the resources we needed through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan that is helping to end child poverty by slashing it in half through the child tax credit. We are watching new opportunities come into our communities through this American Rescue Plan that understands that we have to invest in our communities, but we have to be determined to ensure that it's not a one-time thing. And for women who are thinking about what it means to be determined in this moment of COVID, who are trying to figure out where they fit, we have proven that we fit at the center of the conversations, because where we stand, the world revolves. And we have been determined to ensure our children are going back to school masked up and ready to learn, that our communities are being served by trying to solve the challenges of eviction and rental assistance monies not going out to the communities who need them. We are going to be at the center of making sure that the unvaccinated who are hesitant are not dismissed because of their hesitancy, but are instead met with good information, good opportunity, and the chance to get that shot in that arm to save their lives. And so we know that in this moment, this perspective that we have, that COVID revealed who we are, that our response shows who we want to be. But now the question is, what do we do next? Our obligation is clear. Our first response is to make certain that we don't forget what we've just learned. The Delta variant is doing its very best to remind us that COVID is not gone, that the challenges we face, that the dangers that we face remain, and that if you are unvaccinated, your likelihood of dying from this disease is so much higher than those who are vaccinated. That 99% of the deaths recorded so far are for those who are unvaccinated. And despite our hesitancy, our hopefulness should tell us to get vaccinated. But our responsibility of knowing that we have a broken healthcare system, a broken infrastructure, is that we are each responsible for ensuring that those we know who need to be vaccinated have what they need, whether it's transportation or information, whether it's support because they are afraid that if they get vaccinated and they have to get sick, they can't afford to get sick. We've got to be there to help them afford to get better. And so we have the responsibility to make certain that we respond to COVID, knowing that the Delta variant may simply be the first of many. But we also have to recognize that there are resources that have been poured into our communities, and we are obligated to deploy those dollars. The American Rescue Plan was more than a bill that passed. It was a lifeline. And so as we know, the eviction rental assistance moratorium has ended. That doesn't mean the support isn't out there. Every community has received the resources from the federal government necessary to ensure that rental assistance is made available. The problem is those dollars have to be deployed, and that means we have to hold our local elected officials responsible, our state elected officials responsible, our congressional leaders, and yes, the White House responsible. But this is a team effort. And if you've got good information, especially those who are a part of Rainbow Push, we know how to find information and we know how to share it. And when it comes to deploying these dollars, we've got to be front and center and making certain that our friends and our family and our neighbors and those we've never met do not find themselves faced with homelessness at the moment where COVID is resurging. But we also have to recognize that there's this child tax credit, this transformative law makes certain that we can lift half of the children in poverty out of poverty. But that means that we've got to talk to families who don't know that they are entitled to those dollars. And across this country, in so many pockets, people don't know that the money is not about what they've done or who they are. It's about the fact that their children are. And so we've got to take the responsibility of ensuring that those children get the resources they need by making sure their parents know the resources are available. Part of our obligation is not to simply read the news and respond on Twitter or send something out through Facebook, but to do the hard work of using our networks, using our connections, using our communities to solve our problems, because the monies are coming. We have to make sure they get spent on the right things. That means that we also have to talk to our local leaders who are doing budgets right now. And as they bring in those ARP dollars, those American Rescue Plan dollars, we have to demand that those dollars be spent on equity, not on those issues that have already been addressed. We've got to make certain that those dollars are being spent on the broken places that we have seen. And so we have to do the work of talking to our local leaders, calling our city council members, calling our school board, calling county commissions, and yes, calling your state legislative leaders and demanding that the resources that are flowing in from the ARP flow to the people who need it the most, because that's who needs to be rescued. We have to make certain that our obligation is met with our action. And one obligation that we know remains is the obligation to elect leaders who see us, who hear us, and who defend our democracy. We know what happened on January 6th was not about who won or lost an election. It was about who voted. And too many people who some consider inconvenient lifted up their voices, made their choices, and changed the world. Our responsibility is to respond to those who are trying to take our right to vote away, using Jim Crow and a suit and tie, using lies to try to obscure the truth, which is that democracy is at risk if every eligible American is not permitted to cast an unfettered vote. And so we've got to do the work of demanding the For the People Act be passed and that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act get passed in this legislative year. We've got to respond to COVID. We've got to respond to attacks on our democracy, but we've also got to plan for the future. Redistricting is coming. The 2020 census, which so many of you helped make sure was a well-responded census, have to now do the work of making sure that the lines drawn to connect our communities so we can elect our leaders do not get stolen from us. That those lines are drawn for our benefit, not for our burden. Because politicians don't get to pick their voters in a fair system. Voters get to pick their leaders. And that means you have to pay attention to what's happening in redistricting wherever you live. You've got to be in those meetings, in those conversations, and don't presume that anyone is looking out for you but you. Bring your community together, bring your friends and families together, and make sure you are asking the questions of who will serve you, because we cannot be served by those who do not see us. And that is why we have to fight for redistricting that is fair and equitable around the country. We have to defend our American Rescue Plan and make sure the monies are being deployed. We've got to defend our democracy and ensure that the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act get passed. And we have to ensure that partisan gerrymandering, that racial gerrymandering do not occur in this year's redistricting. If we do those three things, if we meet our obligations with answers, if we understand that this is a moment to prove our resilience, to prove our determination, and to reject the concern that we are not enough, then together we will push forward and we will change the future for all. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, Reverend Wilson, for this invitation, for always being a person who convenes others and finds like-minded activists to bring together so that we can work more closely together. And to each of my sisters, I say to you a hearty good day. And it's a pleasure to meet each one of you. I don't think our paths have previously crossed, at least not recently. It seems that as I listen to you talk about your issues, that we are all concerned about defending democracy. I think I'd like to start off by asking each of you to address briefly exactly what is it that democracy needs defending from, and how are you going about defending democracy? Would anyone care to go first? Maybe Allison Houpt from the League of Women Voters.
Yes, we are concerned, and there's a lot to defend against. There's always been, and it seems like if you look back over history, all of us have always been saying, there's never been a time like this. This is a very large problem. And so we're saying it again now. And to shorten that history, since the 2020 elections, there has been a giant movement to limit voter access. And we are facing, our good friends on this screen and other organizations who are not here today are tracking these developments as laws arise to restrict access to the ballot. And these things are limiting certain populations, disproportionately. So communities of color, women, people with disabilities are being disproportionately negatively affected. And we can't have persons not able to exercise their right to vote, to use their voice. All other issues stem from that. We have to be able to speak. So that is the threat. And the League of Women Voters itself on a national level has just launched a new initiative, Women Powered Democracy, a four-pronged approach to address these issues, which I could go into a little bit more later and allow my friends to also answer your question.
Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you for that overview. That was very good. Who would like to respond next? What about you, Christian?
Thank you, Allison. I love the work the League of Women Voters do. We work all the time with you all. Janice, I think one of the perspectives that now is taken is it's a lot more than just defending democracy. It's also about rebuilding democracy. And the reason why we're taking this approach is that if we look through our history, we see that our democracy has always been embedded with white supremacy and patriarchal perspectives and principles and systems. So if we go back, we see that we've always had Jim Crow era bills and legislation. We always have had voter suppression. We've always had people trying to suppress the votes of women, suppress the votes of people of color, suppress the votes of marginalized communities. And so if we're looking at that, we have to look at what has been deeply ingrained in our system and why are we seeing repeated patterns of voter suppression happening now, what we saw 30, 40, 50 years ago. We keep repeating the same patterns. So we have to take a deeper dive. We have to look at the root cause of what's really happening in our systems and start going, not trying to defend it. We can't defend what's the problem, right? We have to start rebuilding. And we have to start stripping away what's really the deep rooted cause of those things and rebuild and start pulling away the deep-rooted systems of structural racism and institutional racism that continue to perpetuate in our systems of democracy that continually lead to voter suppression. So we have to challenge that. So that's kind of the approach that now is really working with individuals and organizations to do so that we can really make a lasting change and sustainable change in our democracy. So that's our approach. It's like, it's more than just defending it. We have to totally break it apart. And then we have to rebuild it where we have completely called out, put pressure on, held accountable legislators who are trying to go back to Jim Crow era bills, trying to go back to voter suppression that is intentionally made and policies and systems that are intentionally made to segregate, oppress and suppress people and get them out, right? Hold them accountable, pull them out so that we can really have democracy that is fair, safe, absence of violence and equal for all. So that's what we're coming from.
You raise a good point. From your perspective, democracy needs to be rebuilt rather than defended because it has already been disestablished to some extent. I guess the question is, have we ever really had democracy? If you want to go there. Let's ask you, Ms. Katz, what's your perspective from the National Council of Jewish Women? What's your perspective on this issue of democracy and voting rights?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what's been said. Our country and our democracy is stronger when every voice is heard. And in order to promote policies that support women, children, and families, we need to ensure easy and equitable access to the ballot box, because that is the foundation of our democracy. And as Allison shared, it's Black and Latinx communities, Indigenous communities, people with disabilities, people who are formerly incarcerated, and people who don't speak English, who are still being discriminated against at the ballot box, whether through laws making it harder for them to cast a vote, or because polling places are inaccessible to their needs, or deliberate attempts to discourage them to participate in elections through misinformation. And it's important, I think, for us all to remember that Americans don't just vote for president. We're voting for local district attorneys, secretaries of state, and senators who confirm all the federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. And these elections determine the course of our criminal justice system, voting rights, immigration laws, and so much more. So it's bigger than voting for elected officials. We're voting for the future of our country. And that's why it's so critical, and this is so tied up with democracy, that we need to make sure there's more access instead of less access. And I think during a global health pandemic that was unprecedented, it blew my mind that we were seeing legislators try to limit people's access to the voting box in a moment where we needed to expand access because of our health concerns. And that just showed that we've got a bit of an uphill battle here, that this fight is going to be a fight, and that we need to get ready to do everything we can to make sure that A, this is not partisan, but that this is our fight to make sure that every eligible voter has access to make their voice heard.
You've heard the perspectives from here in the United States, Panzili. How does this apply in South Africa? How does this question show up in your country?
Thank you so much. It's amazing how building democracy is a similar topic in South Africa. I come from a country that is only 27 years old. We just came out of a history of institutionalized racism, where women's rights were secondary, and where women had to articulate that women's rights are humans' rights and fight to be part of the table. So in South Africa, we're talking about empowering women to know that they can be part of decision makers. They must be part of the solution, that their role is not just in the kitchen, that they should form part of our governance structures, that they should form part of our courts. We are currently dealing with ensuring that our legislation protects women in as far as gender-based violence is concerned, and ensuring that women are empowered to be the best that they can be. August month is Women's Month in South Africa. That's part of the ways that South Africa tries to ensure that we highlight the issues of women. We commemorate this year 2021, we'll be commemorating 65 years of the Women's March, which was a march by 20,000 women who marched to the seat of apartheid in Pretoria to protest against the then passed laws that required women to carry a pass on them. And this was a march by women from all walks of life, both Black and white women, to say we will not be discriminated against. So as South Africa commemorates 65 years of women empowerment, we are continuing to say that more needs to be done for women. COVID-19 has revealed a big challenge in that we saw that women's rights needed to be protected, because as the lockdown happened, we found more women were finding themselves in difficult situations of gender-based violence. And that's why our government has, as part of our emergency economic reconstruction plan, highlighted women and the youth as being the center of South Africa's future progress, because without that, the country is doomed.
And I think in South Africa, just like in the United States, women have taken an enormous hit from the pandemic in terms of labor force participation rates. And that's why you see proposals to expand childcare, for example. something, and paid family leave, because it makes it easier for women to participate in the economy. And of course, to some extent, our participation in the economy depends on our ability to participate in the decision-making of public bodies and our governments. When I think about democracy, some old-fashioned phrases come to mind, like one person, one vote, due process of law, equal protection. What do you think of? And let's ask, I'll start with Christian again. What do you think of when you think, what is democracy actually? What is it about democracy that we need to either rebuild or restore or preserve? Why do we favor it so? In the United States, we don't have a particular language that we speak. We don't have a religion that we practice. We don't have a culture that we share necessarily, but we do have these sort of ephemeral, flimsy notions about how we ought to conduct public business. And it seems to me that as much as anything, it's those norms, those principles that are not always enshrined in law, that are most in need of redevelopment, reconstruction, rehabilitation, or defense, depending on your perspective. Would anyone like to respond?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ami Gandhi with Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. I'm a voting rights attorney. And I wanted to talk a little bit, jumping off of what my fellow speakers shared, the great insights from our moderator and panelists, that to underscore the importance of both defending and rebuilding democracy, as you all have stated. So given that I lead our organization's nonpartisan voting rights work in Indiana and Illinois, I see very different election systems and both threats and opportunities for democracy among those communities. And talking about unfair restrictions to voting rights, some of the examples of what's seriously been on the table in Indiana in an already very restrictive election system, some of the shortest polling place hours in the country, total lack of access for people with disabilities. I mean, in a way that's just very visceral and offensive, not allowing people who have mobility issues to sit on a chair while waiting in a long line for the polls, all kinds of blatant disenfranchisement like that. And then in addition to that, the legislature working really hard to actively institute even more barriers. For example, trying to require documentary proof of citizenship in order for someone to register to vote, something that Black, Latino, Asian, and other community members have strongly come out against, and explained how specifically that would cause even currently eligible voters to not be able to jump through the documentary proof hoops in order to assert their rights. And then another such restriction that was introduced in Indiana this year was to restrict the already very restrictive absentee or vote by mail system in Indiana. Barely anyone can even meet all the strict requirements right now to vote by mail in Indiana. And then on top of that, the legislators tried to introduce further curtailments this year. And on the flip side, in Illinois, things are far from perfect. Unfortunately, there are still racial disparities in voter access, even in a place like Illinois that's been the site of many innovations for voter access in recent years, like online voter registration, election day registration, automatic voter registration. But we still see that we got to question some of our presumptions about who does and doesn't deserve the right to vote. With the movement afoot to try to re-enfranchise people in prison in Illinois, and that gaining more steam among community members, among legislators in the recent months, it's still touchy to talk about, though. There are still a lot of the segments of the people of Illinois who feel like maybe this is a population that's not as sympathetic. Maybe we shouldn't talk about expanding their rights right now. And I hope that for the purpose of racial equity, for the purpose of fairness, that we question those kind of presumptions that our society has long had about who does and doesn't deserve the right to vote.
How much of this, and this is for anyone, thank you for that. I think you're absolutely right. How much of this do you think is driven by a sort of primordial fear that folk who have been in control of our political systems see the country changing and feel nervous or insecure about their ability to continue in power?
I think that control is always an issue. I think if we look at, every system, control is always the driving force. I don't know if it's any different now than it has been in the past. But I definitely would say that as we look at, what's happened and how I think when we look at the power of the people, I always think we look at the power of the people, right? And we look at how this last election, how the force of individuals have come out and they voted. And we saw the power of individuals coming out and voting in large numbers in communities that maybe normally we wouldn't see votes happen. And I think that was probably scary for a lot, to see that people were willing to really, truly stand in lines for long hours, come out and understand that their voice did matter and they'd have power. And that made a change, and that did create the election and the win for a lot of us that we wanted to see. It uprooted a president that for many they were hoping would be uprooted. And so I think that now it kind of shifted things for people. They were like, okay, now what do we do? And I think, and a lot of times then it goes back to power. So how do what do we do next to try to regain power, and what can we do in the positions that we have to create strategy to get power? And that's very common at a lot of the systems that happen in work. And we're seeing that because even though we may have won the presidential election, there's a lot of power in the wrong hands right now that is still existing. For people who do not, and when I say the wrong hands, I'm saying people who necessarily do not have the best interest of their constituents. Or who are not really looking forward to representing those who need the most help. And so I'm going to speak from a nonpartisan perspective, of course. So I think that that's where we have to look at, what do we need to do in our organizations to continue to educate and encourage and mobilize to make sure that individuals continue to not get discouraged and continue to put pressure on their legislators, on their systems, to make sure that they know that they still do hold the power and not feel powerless in this process. Because it's very easy when you see voter suppression bills happening, you see individuals trying to control your autonomy of your body, you see these things happening, these bills being passed, for you to feel powerless, but you never lose your power, you're just being suppressed. So it's important for people to know they still maintain their power. We just have to create our own strategies to circumvent the efforts and strategies they're trying to make us feel powerless.
Well, and I'd love to add, because I think that's so important. I'm just picturing, I feel like there was this cartoon that went viral, people can think about it, of like all the people who voted and all the people who didn't vote because they didn't think it would matter, and the people who didn't vote that didn't think it mattered was the majority. But I think we forget to comment on the fact that disenfranchised voters, that's not random, that it can feel like your vote doesn't matter at times. Particularly, I would say, as we begin to look at data saying that there are more incarcerated Black men or Black men who have been incarcerated than Black men who are able to vote in this country. This has been systems and decades of work that has led to groups of people in this country feeling like, as Christian was saying, they don't have power. But particularly in the feminist space and the women's space, I try to remind myself and everyone else that women make up the majority in this country, and more of us have power if we choose to take that power and lean into the unlearning that needs to happen that so many of us have been taught. And particularly what inspires me about voting is that as much as I'd like to pretend that it's celebrities wearing a vote shirt that's going to get people to vote, what we've learned is that people vote when their friends vote. And people vote when people in their community that they trust vote, when their pastors and their rabbis and their imams vote, when their neighbors vote. And so the people who have the most power to influence voters are people rooted in communities in relationship with people who are disenfranchised around voting. And what is tremendous around that is we've seen great examples of this recently. I know STACEY Abrams is a part of this program today, who better to hold up to, who clearly herself could have felt disenfranchised from her story from growing up, being turned away from the governor's office, from having so much of this impact, potentially the results of her election. But we're seeing women, particularly Black women in the South, say enough is enough, and we are going to mobilize our communities to take their rightful seat at the table and vote. And so I feel there's a tremendous amount of momentum right now, a tremendous amount of excitement around this, and an awakening that mostly white people in this country have had around systemic racism that is so integrated into the why behind this issue today. So I'm just feeling hopeful, and I hope those who are listening today can actually claim their power by talking about voting with their families and their communities, and pushing for people to get registered to vote and helping people to get registered to vote, because it's easy to do. And that's actually what's going to make the difference in this country.
I'd just like to follow on Sheila and Christian to say that is the stance of the League. And we see places in Illinois where all of this is happening or needs to happen. And when you take it back up to that highest level of the original question of like, what is this ephemeral thing of democracy? It's that power and that control and having everybody have access to it, because in a democracy, the voters choose their representatives. And what's happening right now is the representatives are choosing the voters. And so everybody is getting limited, and the voices can't be heard because they don't know they are allowed to be heard, or they're shut down when they try to be heard. So it's taking that idea and remembering that the voters choose the representatives, and through them, they have the voice. As Sheila said earlier, that's then not just the person we've put in that seat, but it's the actions that they're going to take to make sure that we have an equitable life across our country. And then we're down in our communities, making friends with each other, identifying, educating, activating, mobilizing, doing those things that everybody's been talking about, whether it's in Illinois or in a continent across an ocean. We have to do that same work person to person, to be the trusted messenger, to be the activator and the mobilizer, and take each other along.
I think it's so important for us to have those trusted voices and almost navigators. Nobody can say that the way our government works, whether you're at the city council level or president and Congress, that it's simple. It is not simple. It was designed to have built-in checks and balances and countervailing points of view, and to accommodate those. And I'd like to know what you all are doing to sort of demystify and make people feel ownership in their government, whether it is, like I said, at home, or whether it is more distant.
I'd just like to share about South Africa. Although our system is a little bit different, we elect our representatives on a proportional representation basis, meaning that our people in parliament represent the parties that they belong to. So you find that the mobilization is actually around political organization and political party. And usually the emphasis is on women participating in organizational structures. But that hasn't stopped, though, the community and women's groups who are not political from mobilizing and highlighting the issues that are important to them. A very important part of building our constitution in South Africa is that we have a very robust constitution that has a Bill of Rights enshrined into it. And this constitution has really helped South Africa build a strong democracy. The constitution, for instance, has in it created a commission on gender equality, which assists and acts as a watchdog to make sure that women are not discriminated against. We also have, under the constitution, a South African Human Rights Commission, which was set up in order to help people fight against issues of discrimination. So it's important that people continue to mobilize themselves, not around specifically parties, but to also around communities.
Thank you for that. And we don't have a system of strong parties. We've got the two parties, and at this point, we're very closely divided as to which party we show allegiance to, and it's sort of either or proposition. Would any of you care to comment about, we sort of otherize people. There are certain people who we think are entitled to power, or they think that they're entitled to power. But if you are a woman, or if you suffer from a disability, or if you live in a rural community, or if you're not well educated, there are a lot of people that get pushed to the margins. How do we address that phenomena as we strive to rebuild or restore democracy?
Giving a chance for disenfranchised community members to have a platform, to share their experiences, to share what are their motivations for being civically engaged is of utmost importance. And I have to remind myself of that as a legal and policy person. My voice is not the most important one by any means. And so as much as we advocates and activists can help lift up the voices of people directly affected by the disenfranchisement we're talking about, it's gonna lead us to some really creative solutions in terms of addressing the threats to democracy. In Illinois, just as one example, incarcerated community members helped write and pass civics in prison law. It was enacted a couple years ago, and it's in the early stages of implementation. And it requires in-person peer-led civics education to teach people shortly before they are to be released, to teach people how they can go about reclaiming their voting rights. And the whole idea came from, it's actually similar to what Sheila mentioned a few minutes ago about people really want to hear from someone in their shoes. That's what may motivate them to get involved. And the idea came from a think tank in a maximum security correction center in Illinois. They said they had a vision for what it would look like to have their peers and have their community members, friends and family members more civically engaged. And they thought that the path to that is maybe getting some advice from people like me behind the scenes, but not that we needed to be preaching to people in a different life situation. That is not necessarily going to work. And so as much as that kind of message can be crafted and delivered by people most directly affected, it's really exciting to see what can come from that and what kind of ambitious ideas and astute theories are already out there by people who have long been working on dismantling disenfranchisement.
And you saw a really inspiring example, at least in the beginning in Florida, where they had a ballot initiative that restored the rights of hundreds of thousands of people to vote. But as soon as the legislature convened, they erected new barriers to that law that the people had just voted for and passed, saying that nobody else can pay your fines off for you. You can't vote. Yes, you're eligible to vote, but you can't vote until you've paid off your fines and fees. And I think what that points to, and I would like for any of you to comment, is that this is a struggle that may never get completely solved. As if the further you go back in the history of the country, you see how valuable the vote and citizenship are and what people are willing to do, the kind of barriers. I never thought I would see a president nominate a candidate to the Supreme Court and that candidate not get the courtesy of a hearing. I thought that was beyond the pale, that we wouldn't do such a thing. And I realized that I'm a little bit naive. The older I get, the more naive I am about what's possible. What can we do to work more closely together? We've got great organizations with wonderful missions. NCNW's mission is to lead, advocate for, and empower women of African descent, their families and communities. Doesn't get much better than that. We also have an international focus. We're an NGO recognized by the United Nations, and we're working on the Red Card campaign to end all forms of violence and discrimination against women and girls. But sometimes it feels like the harder we fight, the more backlash we inspire. Nobody tries to limit something that is not valuable. So citizenship must be very valuable because people are investing a lot of energy in trying to limit the parameters of citizenship. Would anyone care to comment? How do we, one of my, and I don't want to talk too much, but I can talk about this for a long time. One of my favorite possessions is a clipping from 1948. My mother was about 28 years old. She was registering to vote in Greenville, South Carolina. Black folk in Greenville, South Carolina did not vote from 1876 to 1948, 72 years, an entire lifetime of disenfranchisement. And so watching, I was born in 54. And so that meant I was part of that baby boom generation. We're going to integrate the schools, teach everybody to treat each other fairly. And to some extent, it worked out. But it seems we take 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. I thought, well, young people will save us because they've grown up in a different system and they understand. And then there was UVA and people talking about, you will not replace me. And I thought, could we, is this Munich in 1939 or is this the United States? How do we keep hope alive, as Reverend Jackson would say, in the face of such fierce and determined, and dare I say, organized resistance?
I'd just start off with a short thought there, like your last word, just organize. To riff on that is just to connect. We all have very specialized foci that have come out of missions that have developed over time, and we're doing great work in our areas and side by side. And I think we need to evolve ourselves in how we just show up to each other and listen and learn, and then do better figuring out of how those pieces that we each bring fit together. So one very simple level, and there's a lot more to it, that we're trying to do at the League is just show up to our partners or our potential partners and just start listening and learning and thinking about, do we have something to offer here? And when people listen to us, they can say, we would really like to take this thing that you are doing and integrate it with what we are doing. So showing up and listening is the super easy first step.
I mean, I agree. I'm thinking, right now, 48 states have introduced nearly 400 bills to restrict access to voting for millions of citizens. And given the assault on voting rights from the states, and now given the green light by the Supreme Court in a recent case in Arizona, there's also a need for expansive federal protection, and it's becoming abundantly clear. So I do think the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act have to be passed to ensure that elections can truly be fair, free, and accessible for all voters. And I think those are tangible things that communities around the country can be working towards. And I think something that I hold on to that I know doesn't always feel right to say, and I want to name my whiteness as I'm saying this too, is I try to remind myself in this work that can be really sad and feel like you're not making, enough progress fast enough all the time, that we are better now than we were 100 years ago, and we're better now than we were 50 years ago, and we're better now than we were 25 years ago. And I think often about the life of Congressman John Lewis, and both how sad it is that we're still fighting this fight and everything he lived through in his life. And Janice, you just mentioned 1948 and your family. And I also think how important it is, the work that has been done over the last several decades to get us to this moment. And I remind myself that change in history, big change, hasn't actually been caused by big moments. It's been caused by a small moment that became the tipping point moment. And I think about someone like Mamie Till Brady, who decided to give her son Emmett Till an open casket, which was then put in the newspaper, and inspired a woman in Montgomery, Alabama, who had never signed up for organizing or community activist training before to get involved. And that was Rosa Parks. And that what happened on that bus that day, like we like to teach ourselves, I used to teach 4th grade, I taught the version of the story we know, but that's not what happened. This was a trained organizer and activist who intentionally got arrested. And that moment created ripple effects in our country to this day. And I hold on to that when I work with our advocates in Illinois and all around the country, because small actions really can make a great impact. We just don't know who the tipping point person and what that tipping point moment is going to be. Change isn't accidental. We make it happen. And that's what I remind myself when we're fighting this fight and sometimes have these devastating blows in the Supreme Court or in other places. It means we have to take care of ourselves, self-care, and then we got to pick ourselves back up and we got to get in and do this work. Because if I could have a conversation with NCJW's founder, Hannah Solomon, from 128 years ago, who founded NCJW when not only women weren't included at the table, but Jewish women weren't included in the women's table. We didn't have access to vote. we didn't have many rights. I know we have more today than ever before, and Jews are not disenfranchised when it comes to voting. We vote disproportionately more than any other faith group. But I think how amazing it is, what that arc is in 128 years. And I think it's the hardest right now for people of color in this country. People of color need to be leading the way in moving us out of this. We need to be following people of color and making sure more people of color have access to run for office as well. But I really do feel inspired by what I'm seeing in this country, an acknowledgement of systemic racism, an acknowledgement of the harm around our democracy not working for everyone, and people time and time again showing up and taking small actions to move us forward. So I think the tipping point moment is upon us. And I really do feel a lot of hope that we can get there if we're advocating for the federal legislation that we need, and we're mobilizing at a community level to be caring about everybody who's engaged in our community and ensuring they have access to vote.
Thank you for that. It reminds me that just last week I was part of a group. I did not get arrested, but I was part of a group of Black women who went to the Capitol with the intention of being arrested to make that point that we will not be ignored. But we do need allies. You know, if you poll on these issues, if you poll on should voting be easy and accessible to just about everyone, most Americans agree with that. If you poll on questions like affordable health care or high quality public education, most Americans will agree with you about that. But it seems that we have some resistance, some disconnect between what the American people want and what we're able to convince legislators at the federal level, at least, to care about. I mean, it's remarkable that to see these legislators from Texas who make $7,000 a year leave home and state and risk arrest. I have no doubt that the governor of Texas will arrest them once they turn up again, that they're willing to take that risk. So sometimes it's about not being as risk averse. And I will say, and please feel free to comment, sometimes I wish there were closer bonds with our white allies. When you stand with us, whether we like it or not, you give us Black women a certain kind of validation because we are the majority. If you add up the people who care about the environment, the people who care about families, the people who care about voting, isn't that a majority of Americans? And isn't democracy, back to that stupid question I asked at the beginning, isn't it really boiled down to majority rule?
I would like to just jump in here.
Sure.
And one of the things I wanted to add, I think is really important to in this work, it's a couple things. The first thing is, I think, before we can be effective allies, is that we have to do our own assessment and our own internal assessment of ourselves and our own work. Because if we go in and we haven't done our own work on ourselves, then we cannot be effective allies. And then I think once we've done our own work, we have to go in, and then we have to be willing to come into community with other organizations and other groups. And when I say community, so we're not being transactional. We're not going in surfacely just to take pictures, just to show that we're there for temporary, that we're coming in intentionally and purposefully to really be part of that group and really truly be in solidarity and to really support the cause and to really be working to support. Because I think that's the difference too that we see. When we really see effective change, when organizations are working with women-led organizations, Black women-led organizations, BIPOC-led organizations, marginalized communities, when we really see the effective change, is because they are really coming in community with them. They're really standing behind them. They're coming to them and saying, what do you need? You are the expert. This is your narrative. We need to know what you need. How do we support you? You're the expert in this. So I think that's the difference when we see work that's really effectively done. Instead of coming in saying, okay, yes, let me tell you what to do in your situation, because I've been doing this in my work, is coming in and asking for, how do you guide us and how do we stand in solidarity with you? I think that's where it becomes effective allyship. And it also becomes very healthy because you're becoming a community with a person and becomes more like a really effective intersectional allyship and bond. And that's where I think I see successful ally and solidarity occur and happen. And I think that's what we need more of, community and less transactional performative allyship. And those are the things I'm looking forward to. And I have seen that happen more often. And so I am happy about that. And I also would like to say, I think that we also need to recognize that regardless if our organizations are focused primarily on one core issue or maybe two core issues, this fight is not siloed. We are in a fight that is going to eventually rotate around to all of our groups. So we have to come in community together, and we have to recognize we're not fighting a siloed fight, a siloed movement, and we have to come together as a whole to support all of us as a whole so that we can, tackle and address this and get to our common cause as a whole. So that's all I wanted to add.
I think that's right. I think that although there is some, when you talk about performative allyship, I love that term, there is some benefit to performance, because until I see it performed, I'm not sure I know exactly what it looks like. And so allyship, if I could be blunt, allyship has more to offer white women than it will cost them. When we still have a majority of white women voting for an acknowledged misogynist who values women not at all, and yet there is something, whether it's economics, I wish somebody would explain to me what it is that would attract the majority of women to vote with and for a presidential candidate who has no regard for women, not even the women in his own family. I am mystified. So perhaps a few performances might help teach a different perspective. The notion that a husband could tell me who to vote for is as foreign as if I was on Mars. That same mother who was getting registered when she was 28 years old voted for Jack Kennedy. My father was for Nixon. He could no more tell her who to vote for. That was unthinkable because they were equal partners in that relationship. So without, people they bring their stuff to the table. I was a member of the League of Women Voters as a law student in Athens, Georgia, because it was the most progressive organization I could find, and I needed that support. That's really where I learned my chops, is at the League of Women Voters, and will always be a member of the League for that reason. And then now we fought for the Equal Rights Amendment, and I marched and carried signs for ERA to show solidarity with other women and saying that women have a place and a voice and have earned the right to speak about the issues that face this nation. So if you're for the environment, if you think that regressive politicians will support your agenda, I think that is a mistaken belief. If you think that they will protect the environment or do any of the things that need to be done that we agree about, that a majority of us agree about, then that is probably a mistaken sense of loyalty.
I did want to mention that
Sure.
Christian, Janice, and Sheila are mentioning also causes me to reflect. I think there is an important responsibility and moment for continued self-reflection of non-Black people of color. One of the reasons that I do this work and have the privilege of being at a historic civil rights organization is to gain tools to better reflect on anti-Black racism in my own community, in my South Asian American and immigrant community. And it's a work in progress. It's going to take a lot of us to continue to dismantle those problems that exist as well, in addition to the problem of white supremacy. But I'm really motivated to be in it together, even if that means part of the work is reflecting on the harms caused by my very own community.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Christian, I'm sure you probably read the decision that came out on the voting in Arizona. What do you think the court was signaling, if you've had time to think about it? They seem to be saying that a little bit of discrimination in voting is to be expected and tolerated.
I'm from Arizona, actually.
Oh.
So, yeah, I took this job. I moved out here from Arizona 2 years ago. So this doesn't surprise me at all for Arizona. Arizona is very red. Arizona has many times went this direction from our criminal justice system, to our legal system. So it's not really surprising to me at all that they felt that that they were entitled to do this. And I'm just not surprised. I honestly, that's all I can really say about it. I'm not surprised at all. I know a lot of my friends are out there on the front lines, you know, like really ready to hit the streets if they have not already hit the streets. I mean, it's just Arizona has always felt that they have the ability to control people's votes, people's opinions, people's bodies, everything else. It's a very restrictive, conservative state. So this vote did not surprise me at the least.
Did the court's opinion of it surprise you any?
Nope.
Nope, not really.
I'm gonna be completely honest, and nothing surprised me about this. I was just, it's disappointing that we're still here, you know, but I was not surprised. I just felt like this is just kind of where I felt that this was expected. I guess I was kind of.
Let's begin with you, Sheila. And we'll go around the table and give our final comments and thoughts as we wrap up.
I'm just so honored to have participated in this with everyone today and grateful for everyone who's joining in. You know, for me, I think that really the opening question summed up so much of this. This is our fight for democracy, and this is our fight to ensure equity in our country and voting, you know, to put this as simple as possible, National Council of Jewish Women, when we say voting is one of our core issues, some people are like, really? Like, I thought your work is about protecting women, children, and families. And then my response is, exactly. And like, this is the foundational issue in order to ensure that everything else any person cares about in this country, as different as it might be, is able to be fair and equitable for everyone. And so we'll continue to do everything we can to be great allies, which is important in this moment, and to inspire our 200,000 advocates to make this a priority every single day. Just in response to where we kind of ended, I do want to acknowledge, you know, in the Jewish community, about 15 to 20% of Jews are Jews of color, but we are an organization that has historically been white and composed primarily of white women. And we work diligently to attempt to be worthy allies and productive partners in our work toward shared liberation. And we acknowledge the work that has to happen internally as an organization and as a country to address racism. And we'll continue to do everything we can to inspire and mobilize our people, but to make sure if we have a seat at the table, we're pulling up the appropriate chair for others. We're actually giving up our seat at the table as needed to make sure, in particular, BIPOC women are able to be the rightful leaders of this next phase of this fight, who should have always been at the helm. And so I'm grateful for so many of the partners on this call, eager to be collaborative and to work with each of you, and feel really inspired and hopeful for the amount of people engaged in this conversation right now who acknowledge this is intentional, this is systemic, and this will only change if we all come together and do the work to make that happen.
Allison, would you be willing to give us a 2-minute synopsis?
Yes, it was an honor to be a part of this group, to appear on the same screen and to be able to share our thoughts with so many people. And the League of Women Voters looks towards exactly what we've all been talking about, doing our important work, but lining it up with our allies and making sure that we are all showing up, listening to each other, figuring out how we can fit in together to bring all our strengths together, to tie us all together is the way that we are going to be able to be the true majority that we want to be. And we have to do it in the most thoughtful and caring ways. And the energy and that the dedication and ideas that you all bring to this is going to power me for days to come. And I'm really looking forward to getting this group back together. The things that the League is really focusing on are what we're all talking about countering mis and disinformation, about increasing voter participation through education and mobilization, and doing our work together to make sure that persons who haven't been able to vote or think they can't vote are voting, and that we protect those voting rights through all of the different advocacy channels that we all have. And one specific thing that really deserves attention and highlights is that we create transparent, people-powered mapping so that we are eliminating partisan and racial gerrymandering, and that when we've gotten those people to be able to vote, that their votes are going to be choosing representatives for them and that they matter. So it's all the same things that we're all doing, and the League is really glad to be a part of this particular group this day, and I hope carry forward after this conversation.
I think it's very interesting that the Council of Jewish Women and the League of Women Voters have been around for such a long time. You've been a part of this conversation for a long time. NCNW has been around 85 years, since 1935. And so we've seen times change and ebb and flow, but it is important to keep hope alive. Well, I think what I want to do now is hear from Panzili about South Africa. What message will you take back? Will you communicate, and how will you engage in this struggle in the US that is so similar in some ways to what goes on in South Africa, except for the parliamentary system we don't have?
Thank you so much. I'm just inspired to listen to just inspirational women on this conversation. As a country, we're celebrating 27 years of freedom. So a lot of the issues that you're talking about are issues that we are grappling with in terms of building a constitutional democracy with a Bill of Rights that work for everybody. Our country, specifically South Africa, is dealing with what we call triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And our late great President Nelson Mandela said, without disrupting poverty, there will never be freedom. And I think that that is what I will take back, that women across the US are talking about inspiring each other, supporting each other intentionally to ensure that they protect their rights, which they've had for decades. So we need to make sure that we come together and protect the rights that we've just had for almost 3 decades.
It is remarkable how similar the issues that women face across the globe, disempowerment, economic discrimination. We're coming up on August 3rd, which is Black Women's Pay Equality Day in the United States. It takes from January to August to earn what a white man earned the previous year to catch up. So these issues are beyond borders.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all. Really appreciated the thoughtful conversation about solidarity and going beyond the surface level in strengthening allyship between our communities and between women. Chicago Lawyers Committee stands ready to help voters over the phone or in person, even if there's not an election currently going on. One way to connect with us is through the National Election Protection Hotline that would work anywhere in the country, 866-OUR-VOTE, 888-VEI-VOTA, 888-API-VOTE, 844-YALA-US. We're available to help people in multiple languages. And sometimes the questions about registration, about getting involved, come at the off times, not only during a hectic election season. And we want to be here to help as a nonpartisan, credible source of information. Really, we try to have a problem-solving, community-based approach. And voters ultimately and community members will make the difference in the conditions that we see. And if we can be a small part of assisting them in legal questions or issues that they may have behind the scenes, we would be humbled to do that. Look forward to chatting with anyone who has questions, who can call us at 866-OUR-VOTE. Thank you.
And that number works. It works all over the United States, 866-OUR-VOTE.
I just thank you all for inviting the National Organization for Women for being a part of this amazing panel with these amazing women feminist activists. We are very grateful to be a part of this panel. I just want to just start off by just reminding us the words that are prescribed on the Supreme Court building, equal justice under the law. And when we think about those words, they're standing for fighting for our rights and protecting our freedom to vote, and for us to participate in a democracy that should be guaranteed for all. And that's what we're all here and we're talking about today, that democracy that we're fighting for right now. And I believe that the work that we're going to do, and if we're all fighting and we're all together in allyship, in community, and in solidarity, we will get to that place where we will have a democracy for all. And I just want to continue to say that in that process that we have to continue to do our work, and we have to continue to represent those communities that are systematically and disproportionately denied their freedom to vote, those communities of color, the marginalized people, so that we know that those are the communities that are continually targeted. We have to work to get the For the People Act passed. We have to work to get John Lewis Voting Rights Act passed. And we have to continue to build our coalitions very strong. And now is right there working and willing to work with any coalition partners, any organizations who want to do that work. So feel free to reach out to me, to now, www.now.org. We are there, we're ready. We are grassroots activism. We are really get on the ground, our boots on the ground, on a phone, anywhere possible. But we thank you today. And all we can say is just let's all get to work.
I want to thank each of you for being so enlightening today. This was a great conversation. I look forward to it continuing. I thank my friend Jeanette Wilson for convening us today and the Rainbow Push Coalition for hosting this panel. Thank you and good day.
Wow, what an amazing roundtable we just witnessed, experienced, and hopefully learned from. But more importantly, gave us the energy and the excitement to keep this campaign moving so that we can win. We started out the roundtable with NATASHA Banks, who is an attorney and one powerful young woman who should be watched because she's definitely going places. I had the opportunity of working with her in the planning of this roundtable, and I was very, very impressed with her leadership. And I'm just looking forward to seeing how she continues to grow. And then we had Stacey Abrams, who I don't have to say a lot about because anyone, unless you've been under a rock, knows how amazing this woman is. She has helped to lead the voting rights efforts, not only in Georgia, but given us throughout this country a template that everyone can use to help to protect voting rights for us all. And then the moderator, Attorney Janice Mathis, who I consider a sister and a friend. She and I worked together for a number of years while I lived in Atlanta. She is one powerhouse, and I'm sure you observed that as she moderated this discussion. And so we just like to thank them and all of the panelists who participated in this roundtable discussion and took time out of their busy schedules because it was just and is just that important to them that we protect the rights of all citizens, and especially those who have been suppressed. But I'm also going to now give you some take action items, because we don't come to a gathering like this that has just this much power and excitement going on without leaving with things, not only things, but a plan to do things that will help to move the campaign that we're working on. And so the take action items are for voting rights, to preserve our democracy, ask your senators, 2 of them, to vote yes on the For the People Act, and that's S1. John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is HR 4 and S4. And the Washington, D.C. Admission Act, which is HR 5 and S5. And I'd like to pause a minute on that one because it just blows me away when I think about the 700,000 people that look like me and others that are part of this event. Black and brown people who live and occupy the city of DC, but yet are not recognized as citizens. They don't have a voting power. And it makes no sense that in this day and age, it hasn't happened. But guess what? We're here to make sure that it does. They have to, DC has to become our 51st state in this year. Then for police accountability reform, to ensure effective policing in our states and the protection of all citizens, contact your senators again and ask that they bring forward and support the George Floyd Justice for Policing Act. Now, we don't even have to talk about all of what took place in our country last year after George Floyd was murdered brutally. And we've got the video to prove it. But what we want to do is to make sure that we protect it from others, from happening to others again. And so we've got to vote this act in law. Then the medical equity and access, to expand access to affordable health care coverage and ask your state and adopt the Affordable Care Act provision to expand Medicaid to adults, and tell your legislators to support the Medicaid Saves Lives Act. And we know that it does. It has already, and it can continue to do so if we support the act. Equitable COVID-19 vaccine availability. As the American vaccine supply begins to outspace its demand, we must do our part to close the gap on the global vaccine shortage. Contact your legislator and ask for support on global COVID-19 vaccine expansion efforts. Debunk the myths of the COVID-19 vaccines are medically proven to save lives and help minimize transmission. Confront misinformation with the facts. As we use more vaccines, COVID-19 cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are diminishing. Encourage your family, friends, and community to get vaccinated, and encourage them to do that today. So these action steps that I just read to you are on the backside of your program. So if you're able to see your program, you'll be able to see those action steps and what we're asking you to do to follow up, to do your part. Do these actions today and continue to do them, and continue to tell others that this is what has to happen in order for us to protect and preserve our rights.